All right, everybody. Thanks for coming and watching this. There's something I need to talk about before we start, though. This is Dr. Irving Finkel. He's a fantastic scholar, studies Assyriology, cuneiform texts, ancient Sumer, Assyria, Babylon, all that. Knows an absolute one of the most knowledgeable people on the planet in these subjects. But Dr. Finkel is not a believer. I don't frame this interview as from a Christian standpoint or something like that. I don't give him any pushback when he says things, and most of the things regarding the way the Old Testament was put together, outside of the nonchalant view that he takes, I agree with. I do not believe in dictation in the Old Testament. I don't think God told every word that should be put in there. I also believe that a lot of Genesis 1 through 11 are referential texts to previous held mythologies, but they are framing them in the correct lens. It's polemic. So, with that in mind, all I really need to stress here is that just because someone doesn't agree with you on a subject like this about the Old Testament doesn't mean you should shut them out for other uses. Dr. Finkel knows so much about all these ancient cultures that it's very useful for biblical studies to understand this, and so you don't enter an argument and just get slaughtered. So, hear him out. Enjoy the interview. I had a great time. He's awesome, very funny, just a character, an absolute character, and I hope to talk to him again in the future. I hope you enjoy this, and God bless.
Inscriptions, and we have about 130,000 tablets there, and they cover about 3,000 years of time. So it is a fantastically rich collection of all sorts of tablets, of all sorts of subjects for 3 millennia. So when I got there, among other things, I had keys to the cupboards. So I spent a lot of time, apart from doing what I was supposed to do, going through the collection, looking at all the tablets. So it's impossible to read 130,000, but the thing about them is that when you see them we keep them in glass top boxes, Victorian boxes actually, in numerical order. And when you look at a tray of tablets, when you have experience, you can see by their appearance the sort of things they are. That's to say, business documents or letters or school texts or other sort of genre. Even without taking them out of the box, you can read through the lid and you get some kind of hang of it. Anyway, I worked on magic and medicine for my thesis, and I've always been interested in that stuff. And on going through the collection as I did, maybe 6 times, when I came across something which was interesting to me, I made a note of it. And so I found a lot of medical texts, a lot of literary texts, and a group of ghost texts. And so I written things on various matters, and then it occurred to me that it'd be interesting to write a book about ghosts in Mesopotamia, because it's hardly ever mentioned. And there are lots and lots of books about ghosts, and most of them are nonsense and written by people to make money, or they're written about untrue things, or they're sensationalist, or they're very, very, very dry and tedious. And I had thought it'd be interesting to write a book which put the Mesopotamian evidence on the map, because when people wrote so-called histories of ghosts, which people do, they usually stop at the Middle Ages. Sometimes they go back a bit before that, but hardly anybody has incorporated the evidence, say, in Greek or Latin, of which there's tons, absolutely tons, and there are many good books on it. And before that, no one even knew. So when I started putting it together, I discovered I had a lot of stuff, and it was enough to make a narrative about the subject as a whole. And so I started work on it. and it was very interesting to do. And then I started making joins, because the other thing is that lots of the tablets in the British Museum, like elsewhere, arrived in the 19th century. They're very often not complete. And sometimes, if, for example, 10,000 tablets came in one batch, you might have a piece of a tablet which is very incomplete, but on examination, if you're lucky and acute, you can join to make a larger piece, and sometimes an even larger piece, and sometimes you get a whole tablet out of bits. So this means that the value to anybody who's interested is increased 1,000-fold, because otherwise you have things like God so and so XXX ... and he ... and all that kind of stuff, which is useless. So, but when you get joins, you get narrative. And so I found enough to do it. So I started out blithely thinking it would be a simple matter. There I was wrong. It's very complicated. And then what happened was, there was COVID struck the world, and curators like me were sent home for the best part of 2 years. They called it furlough, which is an old English word for leave, and nobody had ever heard this word before. It was an old army word and such like. And all of a sudden, everybody all over the world was using this medieval word furlough. It's rather amusing. Anyway, I was sent home for 2 weeks, and the important stricture was that you were not allowed, if this happened to you, to do any museum work. This was the whole nature of it. So I've been struggling with this book, and my publisher was beginning to write letters saying, how are we getting on? And on one occasion, do we need to employ a ghost writer, which I thought was a very mean thing to say. And in that 2 years, I just did it. It was a godsend to me. It was a disaster for the whole world. But for me personally, it was rather a lucky break. So I finished that book and sent it off. And that was that. So the thing about it is, I have an idea about these books, the way to do them, because if you work in a field which is somewhat arcane, like Assyriology, where most people don't know anything about it and don't see any reason to find out about it, the bulk of the work which is published is written by scholars for scholars. It's a kind of self-perpetuating matter, and people try to get things right, of course, and they try to make a contribution, but they seldom look above the horizon to what you might call a wider readership, only sometimes. And when this happens, colleagues are often very rude and say, oh, well, they've sold out. They're writing popular books, and all the rest of it. And I had a conception that it's possible to write a book for a wide audience, which is not selling out, and which is not softening and being condescending about knowledge, but to find a method of discussing the evidence, and even grammatical evidence, or the meaning of ancient words, in order to get sense out of it, and sharing that with the reader. So in other words, you have a book which is not a purely academic book, but it's not a purely pop book. It's something in between, with the evidence there if anybody wants to take it further. So I did this with a book called The Ark Before Noah, and then did it with the book about ghosts. And I'm now going to do a third one of the same kind of approach, which is about the royal game of Ur, and publish the same kind of synthesis without hiding the difficulties, and sharing the difficulties, and saying this word might mean that, it might mean that, and I don't know for certain, but of course, so that the reader, in a way, shares with you the experience of discovery and understanding. And those two books, where they've been reviewed, where it's come to my attention, it's been a successful idea. That people feel at the end of it they've got something, and they've learned something, and they're interested, and they want to read more about the culture. So that is most satisfactory to me. So that's my plan, and I don't know whether my colleagues despise me for it. The very serious colleagues whose opinion I respect all said that they thought the ghost book was excellent and would be recommended to their students and things like that. So I felt rather pleased. So that's exactly what happened. I did it, and then I found some jolly juicy things, especially the picture of the ghost on a tablet, which is a unique thing.
That's the one that's in the Guinness book. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's, I think, the only cuneiform tablet that's ever got in the Guinness Book of Records. I think all my colleagues now are going to be trying like mad to find something even more exciting. But the guy who runs it came and he was ever so impressed. And we have a certificate from the organization in honor of its entry. So I thought that was rather a peachy thing to happen. So that's it. And one of the things is that our collection mostly came in the 19th century when archaeology was new, and thereafter, before the modern world, where laws about what comes out of the ground and where it should be and where it should be exported or collected, which is, of course, in the modern world, a very serious matter for contention, simply didn't apply. So in the 19th, 20th, and the early 20th century, when there was a big archaeological excavation in Iraq, with sometimes hundreds of workmen, so they really they really made progress. The prevailing government, the Turkish administration, there was an agreement about what would happen to the material, and so tablets came to us in great number. And it's just an unimaginably marvelous collection. And one of the problems is there are not enough people who do this sort of work. Because in the modern world, where all the values are cockeyed, people think that universities that do the arts are a waste of money, and that we don't need art galleries, we don't need concert halls. You know, everything that we took for granted as being the essence of culture is questioned by people and undermined by people, and museums are one of them. And at the same time, students who want to go to university to find something interesting, it's not very often that one of them thinks, Assyriology sounds like the career for me. And there are hardly any universities in Britain now where they teach this stuff. So we have the facilities afforded by digital photography, which have changed the face of it, because it's possible to make digital photographs one by one of a given tablet, all the faces of it, the edges of it, all the signs, in a way that you can zoom in and zoom out. And when they're online, it means people all over the world can have control over the documents and work on them without having to come to London and sit at a desk and do it in the British Museum. So the thing opens up, the facilities in the modern world opens up, and there are not enough people to join what I was called the cuneiform army, you know, that we could support lots of people, or for all the universities did it, and all that. I mean, lots of people working, because the subject is complicated. You have to learn these two languages, you have to learn the grammar and all the signs. But the thing is, whatever you're interested in, we have this stuff. And unlike many cultures, so we have astronomy, proper astronomy, mathematics, astrology, lexicography, history, and of course, magic and medicine, telling the future, all those things, as well as tablets to do with daily life and administration by the government and the army. Every aspect of life is on these unappetizing, strange-looking things, and there's enough for lots of people to work on it. And it saddens me, because in the 18th century and the 19th century, all people who went to university, obviously they had advantages from the kind of family they lived in, or whatever. If they went to Oxford or Cambridge, or they went to one of those smart schools, they all knew Latin and Greek. And all kids learned Latin and Greek, unless they went to village schools and then they were sent to work when they were 11. But ones who had an education knew Latin and Greek. And lots of people worked on Greek material, you know, the manuscripts, and they translated the plays and the poetry. And sometimes lots of people worked on the same thing, and different translations came, and that was not a bad thing. It was a good thing. And in fact, there was lots of work to be done and lots of people doing it. And now we have lots of work to be done and hardly anybody.
Really? So with all that going the way it is, with all these digital library, the way it's set up, is anyone implementing AI into this to get some artificial intelligence that's already going on?
Well, there are two basic areas, theoretically, where progress like that can be made. One is as I said, the tablets are often fragmentary or broken. So one of our most important collections is the Royal Library from Assyria from the 7th century, when there was an Assyrian king called Ashurbanipal, who was a famous warrior and a famous administrator, you know, a proper king in the ancient world, but also had this library. And in the 19th century, they found this library rather the worse for wear, with many fragments, many broken tablets, about 20,000 of them, which came to London. And so a lot of what we know, because of the scholars who worked on it, since these tablets are very clearly written, a lot of what we know comes from the tablets in this library. All the genre I mentioned before are attested in this library. So it's really, really important. And one thing is, if there are 20,000 tablets and pieces, you can make a join if you work on something and then you see something and you think, ah, this goes here. But this is a very slow and pedestrian way. Mm-hmm. So if you have digital photographs of all the pieces, then if you are energetic and your program allows it, you can make joins by, when you have a large piece with a jagged side, and you look at the fragments of the same kind of thing, and you see a profile that fits, you can actually move it on screen and find joins that way. And if you have a sophisticated program of investigation, that can be very fertile, and the more people that do it, the more it happens. And of course, the idea is to join as much as possible. So that mechanical thing has a great advantage as being more efficient, perhaps than a person like me, who makes a lot of joins by flair or by memory, but not by system. And they could do it by system. So, you know, when you do a jigsaw, you open the box and you have all the bits on the table. The sensible person makes all the edges first, and then they get all the blue stuff for the sky and all the green stuff for the grass. And so and it's the same thing. If you have the left-hand side of a tablet and the top's missing, then you know the machine would look for a bit that fitted along the top to help construct it. So that part of your question, yes, it can be done. It's just expensive. The other side is to try to persuade a computer to translate inscriptions. This is a much, much more complicated thing, but in my opinion, theoretically, it should be perfectly doable, because if I can do it with my brain, then I think a computer, with its greater extent, should certainly be able to do it. So when you see a cuneiform tablet under your eyes, the first thing is that there is no gap between the words. They wrote in a continuous line. So when you're a student, when you're a beginner, this is a problem. You have to learn how to select the right values to make words, because all the signs have more than one value or use. So when you see a line of cuneiform, your mind goes like, and you test things that fit together and make a word. And you can only do that if you know all the values of the signs, which are sometimes rather numerous. And secondly, the vocabulary of the words themselves. Because if you have a word in Babylonian, there's more than one way of spelling it. So, for example, the word Sharatu means queen, the noun queen. And so in Akkadian, you can write it Sharatu with 3 signs, or you could write Sha'aratu, or many other things as well. There might be 5 or 6 alternatives. And the computer would have to have sufficient mobility when it sees a word and the signs to work both together to find the right word and that would fit with the signs available. So this is, when you do it professionally, so to speak, or as an Assyriologist, you do this all the time. The mind does it all the time. So if you work hard, I can read cuneiform like newsprint more or less, unless if there's a break or damage or something. But normally speaking, and this is something very esoteric or complicated, but normally speaking, I can read cuneiform like a person might read the Times newspaper. So you could get that out of a computer if you put in everything, which would say all the signs, all the values, all the words and the grammar. So there's a 4 sacks of things. And on top of that, my dear sir, there is the problem that over 3,000 years, the shapes of the signs evolve. So you've heard of King Hammurabi. He had a very fancy sign form arrangement, but the Ashurbanipal ones are very economical and streamlined. So you also have to teach the computer that one particular sign could look like this, like that, like that, like that. And the ones at the two ends are often rather difficult. So you'd have to have a very obedient computer with endless space and people to put in step by step all that was necessary. I believe that in principle it shall be perfectly possible. And the result would be something like this. In the old days, if you bought from Asia a camera, it would come with instructions in a kind of English, which was done by somebody working from the native language with a dictionary, looking up each word and putting them together. So when you read it, the first thing you would do was laugh, because sometimes it's so absurd, but you would know what had happened. So you'd be able to adjust. And this will be the same kind of level, probably more diffuse. But with the passage of time, if it was pursued and controlled and progress was looked for, it should be perfectly possible to design it. We discussed it once with Google, and they said because Google has this ambition, it used to be able to translate anything into English. That was their, I believe, their initial plan. But then now it's much more sophisticated. Theoretically, it's to translate any one language into any other language. So that's a really serious problem. And I thought, well, if they can do that, what's wrong with Babylonian? And they came and looked at it and discussed it. And I think the thing was to do it properly will be very costly. And they have priorities which are not deciphering clay tablets. But I imagine one day this will happen. And there's another reason why it might become very much more important, because at the moment it's for experiment and for investigation. But the maxim is, we have 120,000, probably there are 200,000 tablets out of the ground in the museums of the world, something like 200,000 collections, museums, and so forth. Well, the flip side of that is that almost all tablets ever written are still in the ground, because clay lasts in the ground. So unless it was willfully destroyed, the chances are that there are millions of tablets in the soil of Iraq, millions of them. And in a way, it's quite a good thing that most of them are still there. But if the world, for example, gave up wars, I know it's a big thing to ask, but say they had a plan that they'd give up wars and take up archaeology, and so that there was extensive excavation of Iraq, there would be millions of tablets. And at that stage, if that ever does happen, that sort of thing, then a program which you could put them under and it would go across and give you a basic translation would be something that would be much more urgent, so to speak, than it is now. Of course, if they do it now, I'll be out of a job, so I'm not so keen.
They need to wait a little while. Wow, that's actually really wild that y'all have already had that conversation with Google. That's cool though, because that means at least it's in the mind of them.
It's in the mind, and I think individuals have had a go at it as well, because wherever there's a bunch of geniuses in a lab, and they get an idea like this, they put their heads together and see. But I've read that things have been done and so forth. But it's like all these things. It's a faltering beginning, but in the end, I think it will become perfectly possible. I mean, the miraculous things happen. For example, if you have a burnt scroll with the letters rolled up inside, they can read without opening the scroll with a computer inside and turn it round, and it's incredible.
Yeah,
so,
they did that a lot in Qumran, correct? Isn't that where that came into use when they pulled the Dead Sea Scrolls?
Yeah, that's right. So I mean, there's no limit to what human brains can do. It's absolutely staggering, and they spend all their time fucking around. I mean, it's amazing, killing people, the amount of, I mean, it's atrocious. It's atrocious when you think what you could do. However, we just have to hope for the best.
Yes. I had a couple specific questions about the book. Well, the first one, really, I guess where I would start is so you said it multiple times. I've seen you say it in multiple lectures, and it kind of seemed like it bothered you, and I couldn't really wrap my head around it either. And it was the idea of when they drew the ghost up, why? I mean, I had a idea of maybe why, but it involved a second question. But I'll finish first. But why would they trust them that they're telling them the truth? That I just can't wrap my head around that when they know that they have this conception that there's demonic entities as well. Why? I guess how would they know that what they're getting? I get that there are the ways they differentiate on how they know, but how do they know that a demonic entity isn't lying to them? But the second question that maybe plays into that is the skull. I know that they would prefer to have for sure the skull of the person they're trying to contact,
I
but
imagine.
is there any instances of them not having the skull of the person and them using just any skull and still trying to draw up a person?
Okay, those are two really good questions. The first one is that the magic, which is designed to bring a spirit of a dead person into a skull to speak, that magic process is ringed around with things and specifically designed to bring up a ghost, and it wouldn't work with a demon. I mean, there's hardly any evidence that they tried to bring demons up. That's not what they did. I mean, with ghosts, they usually want to get rid of them, but sometimes they brought them up. But with demons, nobody wanted to bring demons up. It's not like Dennis Wheatley and circles and all that fork tail stuff. None of it. The demons, the trouble with the demons, you couldn't kill them, and they had no mercy in them. But I don't think a cruising demon, seeing that necromancy was going on with a skull, would think, "Oh, I'll change myself into a ghost." And I don't think so. I don't think so. The trouble about answering your question simply is that there's no other evidence of this than what I published. There's no accounts of it, or things that went wrong or anything. We don't even know what the questions were, and it's my assumption that you use the skull of the person you wanted to interrogate, or at least a family skull, which is a kind of intuitive idea and not proven. But when you have the fact that the bones of your dead were accessible to you, that makes it much more credible. Because if people are, I mean, they were never cremated, but if you're buried in a cemetery, 3 miles out into the steppe, I mean, no one's going to trail out there with a spade and dig up their auntie. But if their offerings are made for them and people know where they rest, and especially if you have a vault where successive dead people are added, then the idea of procuring your great uncle's skull is not fanciful. And I also have the idea that if I was a ghost, you wouldn't want to come up, you wouldn't want to do it. And like with Samuel in the Endor thing, why have you disturbed me? That is, it kind of rings true that a ghost wouldn't want to come up, and the force of the magic draws them up by the words. So the sun god works on them so that they're dragged into the skull. And I think the whole thing would be less credible as a Babylonian conception if it was any old skull belonging to any old person. Now, the other part of your interesting question is, how do we know? Would they know they told the truth? Well, this is a thing that I find very remarkable, because they simply wouldn't. They simply wouldn't know. But I suppose they would regard that as a minimal risk. So the thing is, it was quite a palaver to get a professional to come and do this. And I'm sure you had to fast beforehand and abstain from playing rugby and having sex and things, and so that you were in such a state. And the priest would come, and there'd be a lot of hanky-panky organizing and cleaning and this and this and this. So it's a big operation. And then the thing itself would be rather traumatic. And I'm sure it would be rather traumatic, assuming it, as it were, happened and it worked. And I don't think there would be room for skepticism about what the ghost told you as an automatic response. I could imagine that you might ask a question where that when the answer came, you found it hard to believe. But I doubt that they would have room in their grasp of this enormous activity for a ghost that would willfully not tell them the truth. Although, as I wrote in a cynical moment in that book, most things that people tell to one another are not truthful. People lie like anything. And people no doubt lied like anything in Mesopotamia, and probably the ghosts did too. But, you know, did they ask questions like, where did you bury the silver? That's one thing. Or who's going to win the Grand National? That's another thing. Or am I the father of my daughter or not? And those sorts of questions. Because I think the things which they asked must have been pretty heavyweight. You know, it wasn't...
it's not trivial to do this.
Not trivial to do that. And I think also you might try it on, like you might go to an alternative doctor. You don't believe it really, but nothing else works and you're going to die anyway. And you go to an alternative doctor and they try something and all of a sudden, goodness me, it seems to be working. You know, it might be like that. It might be like that. So
almost a placebo, tricking themselves into, or not tricking themselves, but just believing that it's working. Or
yeah. And if it's very expensive, you're probably likely to believe it too. But there is this later text from rabbinic sources when they said that they didn't really hear the voice and they imagined it and all that. And of course, this is looking backwards into their ancient past. But I think at the time, the texts that we have are so matter of fact that they're not, oh my goodness, no, this is really dark stuff. So we'll shrouded in mystery. It's like any other procedure. You know, when you want to do this, you recite this 3 times, you do this, like all the other things against disease and demons and against ghosts and all that. It's all the same sort of procedural instruction. It's not marked dangerous or anything like that. And also, you might remember that we had this Ashurbanipal who had the library when he was crown prince. There was some dispute in the court about whether actually his older brother was supposed to become king. And I suppose everybody knew that Ashurbanipal was the right person and the older brother wasn't quite so suitable. And there was probably intrigue going on there about it. But the important thing is that Ashurbanipal called up his grandmother, with the help of a necromancer, to find out whether he was going to be crown prince. Now, that's not a footling thing by any manner of means. And the necromancer who was there was possessed of dynamite information. I mean, really dynamite information. So the fact that we only have such a little amount, and one of the 2 things that we have is on the highest level in the kingdom, gives you an idea that it was a heavyweight matter.
So interesting. It's just you know, because you think of the kinds of things that people try to say even about religion and stuff, that, well, they don't really believe that, they're just saying and doing it because they're just walking the cultural steps or something like that. But I even think that just looking at the way that they're saying it isn't even the way that modern religion kind of talks about itself. Like they're talking about this in what seems to be the same way they talk about their taxes, about what they're going to eat, about where they're walking to. It's just, they're just talking about it. And and I understand there's the mythical text and things like that, but it seems to be so separate from this, that they know that what they're writing is literature versus everyday instances. And it's a weird thought to wrap your head around, of just everyone believing, or not even believing, as you said, it's just matter of fact, it's just take for granted. Ghosts are just a part of everyday life.
I think that's the essence of it, that of taking them for granted, because when you get to a horizon where you either believe in them or you don't, then the original structure disappears, and you get what comes into it is faith and skepticism and argument. But I couldn't find, and of course I looked wide to see anything where some Mesopotamian gave a clue that he didn't believe in ghosts, or that somebody else didn't believe in ghosts. The whole of the literature is expressed in this way. And there is a strong tendency among people who work with ancient material to think that it's naive if you, as it were, take what they say at face value, that you always have to stand back. And everybody knows that people don't believe in God until they get cancer, and then all of a sudden they remember, that kind of thing, that people go to church and at the same time they're rapists and child molesters and burglars. And so the whole business about religion is very complicated in our world, about what people really believe. I mean, I know quite a lot of clergymen who simply don't believe in God. So this is an interesting thing, but I don't think that the issue was alive in Mesopotamia about whether or not things were true. I mean, the way they talk about demons and what they do to people, it's not a figure of speech. It's not a figure of speech. And that is the essence of it, I think, so that we can think, oh, how cute, how they looked at it that way. I don't think so. And I tried to put in, what the kings do on things to show that it was everybody in the kingdom, top to bottom. If you ask them, do you believe in ghosts, they would look at you with incredulity.
Because that's kind of the way that I think, you regularly hear something like, well, religion's used to, regardless what side of the argument anyone's on, but, people use religion to control masses and things like that. But even in this context, you have the king doing these rituals. He's not using this as a way to get people to do, oh, well, if you don't do this, the gods will be mad at you. He's doing it. He believes it. There's no one around him, unless these scribes are just super secretive about, don't write it down or whatever. It's everybody. I mean, it's across the board.
In support of it, there's a whole different other argument, in that there are places in the world where this situation still prevails. Like, I mean, I've done research in India and about board games in India. And if you are sitting there talking to a person and you say, oh, incidentally, are there any ghosts in the village? They're not going to say, oh, come on, man, really? The response to that question is, how much time have you got? And everybody knows. And there are places in the world, many places in the world, where lots and lots of people believe in ghosts without any belief or otherwise. They just know about it. And I talked to people who work in hospitals in South America, where there's a building that was once a lunatic asylum, then it was a brothel, then it was a hospital, and especially for drugs. So hundreds of people had died in that building, and everybody saw them. There wasn't anybody who said, oh, come on, I got in the lift, no, it was a flash of lightning deflected from a mirror or something like that. Everybody testifies to it. So I kind of think that ghosts in a default position are part of the universe in which human beings exist and always have. And then it's religion in the modern sense, and especially science in the modern sense, which, as it were, ruins it, because the innocence of it is destroyed in a, so to speak, intellectual environment, or in complex cities or universities and all those kind of things. That the people often today are embarrassed to mention ghosts, to talk about ghosts. They don't come up with it, and it's because in the face of religion and or science, you have to be defiant about believing in it. So everything is different. Everything is different.
That's just such a wild way for us to go with that. I just feel like it's so, I mean, like myself, I don't have any issue with the idea of, like, I haven't, I've had experiences, like I you said you haven't actually ever seen anything, and I don't know that I've ever seen a ghost, but I've had, everybody gets the oh, what's behind me when I'm running up this stairwell in the dark, or something like that, or just like a feeling of presence. I feel like most people have experienced something like that. But I've definitely never seen anything. But I just, honestly, I mean, in reality, I feel like your book has kind of pushed me to where I'm like, well, I think that your what to do with the 12 Nobel Prize winners at a dinner party is accurate, and I would think that that is probably true, and that makes me think about, well, I probably believe that there's too much data on people seeing these things over too vast of a period of time to say, well,
And
there's no
geography.
ghosts. And
And
yeah,
geography.
everywhere. I mean, everywhere. It's not, I mean, if people want to say that there was some ancient civilization all the way across the earth because there's pyramids in different places, but you won't say that there's ghosts or something. I mean, not that that's reasonable, just a silly analogy, but it's everywhere. And it's from
Yeah.
beginning to end, still present. So there's something. So that I kind of want to ask, what do you personally believe about ghosts? What do you think?
Well, this is my answer, and I'm not being a wriggly politician. I know lots of people who have told me that they've seen a ghost or see ghosts, whom I see absolutely no reason to disbelieve whatsoever. I mean, people I know have told me, and other people, and what they've told me, you've got the choice. You either believe what they say or you disbelieve it. So it means you're called upon all of a sudden in normal intercourse with a person to go, no, lies, and then go back to normal because of the trigger of the word ghost. People don't blurt out about this stuff, I can tell you. And it's my impression that a high proportion of people have had an experience of one kind or another. And I think this will always be that way. One of the messy things about the scientific attitude to ghosts is that they don't believe a word of it, whatever you tell them, bang. And on top of it, most seriously, science says that in order to demonstrate that something's true, it has to be repeatable. That if you do an experiment to demonstrate some theorem, it has to be repeatable. And if somebody sees a ghost, how can you say that has to be repeatable when there's somebody there waiting for it? Because it might not work that way. So that their last ditch defense that for something to be credible, it has to be supported by a reiterated occurrence is unfair to demand of ghosts. So I don't know what to say about it. But for example, I never ask anybody, but when I've given lectures at conferences, at book literary festivals, for example, lots of people come up. So I have to tell you what happened to me, and there's no way that they were thinking, oh, I know, I'll tell him that I know, I've got a really good idea. I'll tell him this, see if he believes me. It was something, it always has this kind of introduction that, when I was 9 with my cousin once, or my wife, she once told me, although she regretted it afterwards, that when she was a girl, she'd, and all those sorts of things. Anyway, this lady, I was in the Lake District and gave a talk about the book and everything. And this lady afterwards came up to me and said, well, something odd happened to me. So I'm always very interested to hear what people have to say. And she says that when she was a teenager, she was in her bedroom on this second floor of their family house in the early evening doing homework or something in the summer. And she looked out the window and she saw her grandfather walking across the lawn. And she was poleaxed with surprise because her grandfather was dead. Now, the thing is, if you look out the window and see an old man walking across the lawn, you don't think that's an old man, it's somebody's grandfather. Perhaps it's my grandfather. Oh, yes, of course, it must have been my grandfather. She recognized her grandfather, right? So she ran downstairs into the kitchen where her mother was standing at the sink, slumped over on her hands, staring out the downstairs window, overlooking the same garden. And when her daughter came in, she turned around and said, "You're never going to believe what I saw my dad walking across the grass." Now, that's not evidence. It's got no validity to it. And it's hearsay because she told me. But I would go to the stake to defend the idea that she didn't make that up. Because when she told me, she obviously hasn't talked about it. The hairs on the back of my neck started to wiggle around, because it was a testimony of such simple clarity that you could not gainsay it automatically. Nobody could. I reckon if you put her in the Albert Hall on a stage, everybody in the audience would believe it. what she says. It's just, it's so compelling and it's so simple and it's almost like a scientific demonstration. And if it isn't a demonstration, it means that she is a very brilliant actress. And she's been waiting all of her life for a dupe like me to tell them, it's just not on. It's just
Yes,
not on.
and especially when you take that and you compound it by the millions of examples of that exact thing. I mean,
Well,
you
exactly.
can't just
That's a
throw it
very
out. I
neat
mean,
one. Yeah, it's a very nice one to have in the palm of your hand because it's so to the point, really.
Um, kind of pull away from the book here. I had a few questions from followers and stuff that just had some things they wanted to ask you. One was, have you ever, and I think I've seen you answer this, but maybe not since maybe something's happened. Have you ever tried any of the spells?
No.
Never got the opportunity.
Well, I had the opportunity. As a matter of fact, I have my skull. So theoretically, we could have a go at necromancy, but the stuff that you need for the oil is rather difficult to find. You can't go out to a store and buy it. And I've never met anybody who was curious to try it. I don't know. I wouldn't be scared, but I don't know that anything would come doing it. I've never really thought about doing it seriously.
Okay, and then one was, who are the Anunnaki and why are they not ancient aliens?
The Anunnaki are a group of 600 gods. They're gods, and they're well known. They exist in texts. They often get mentioned. There are two groups, the Anunnaki and the Igigi, and they move above and below, and they have various roles to play, but they are among the other deities of ancient Mesopotamia. How anybody tied that in with aliens, I have no idea. But I should think anything that has the word Anunnaki in should be handled with a very long pair of tweezers until you get clearance from somebody who knows about cuneiform, who can tell within 2 minutes whether it's about something worth reading or whether it's absolute twaddle.
All right, not ancient aliens. Put that to rest then. Okay, so one, this is actually
if tomorrow morning something lands on the lawn in our house and I'm whisked up into the sky and never seen again, then the laugh's on me. Okay.
All right, we'll keep that in mind then. This is actually from Michael Jones. He runs a fairly large YouTube channel. He was reading a scholar named Mark Smith, I believe. He didn't tell me what, I just jotted his question down. He didn't tell me what his specialization was. I'm going to assume Semitic studies of some sort because I think he's a Old Testament scholar. But he has the proposal that the Genesis flood story is from its own oral tradition, and he had a few reasons why. One of them being that it is rather short. If you were to convey it over back up into Akkadian or something, it would be a fairly short story. And his argument was that that would mean that it wasn't really expounded upon like what we would think if it was pulled from this so much older of a tradition from the Mesopotamians. What do you just thoughts on that, or is that just hogwash?
Well, the way I look at it, point one is that the flood story in Mesopotamia is part of a long literary narrative with build-up and tension and the difficulties under which the Atrahasis operated, and then the whole thing is a long narrative. And the thing in the Bible is a digest of it, where they take out of it the essential points. And the reason that I say that is, it seems to me that in the Mesopotamian tradition, the gods had decided that the human beings were tiresome and irritating, and they were going to obliterate them and replace them with something. But the flood was only one of the things to which they exposed them. It was the last one. And when there was fire and starvation and I don't know what, and this was the last one, and because of the Mesopotamian dependence on water and the vulnerability of them to interference with water, the story ends up that they weren't destroyed, and there's a rainbow in the Babylonian tradition, like in the Bible. So you have a whole long thing. Now, when the early part of the book of Genesis was written, the whole point of it was to explain quickly and intelligibly about the beginning of the world and what happened in all those Adam and Eve and the flood and the patriarchs and all that, squeezed into a simple, straightforward narrative in order to show that God was all powerful and really very unforgiving and very, very harsh, but again didn't allow the world. So they took the Babylonian motif, I believe, and used it for their own principle. But whereas the flood in the Babylonian world was to shut the noise up, which annoyed the gods, in the Judaic philosophical view, the thing it combated was sin. It was a moral question. And they took the program notes, so to speak, and told the story in a very apocalyptic way, which is very punchy and very effective, without all the padding. So it seems to me there's no question that the second is derived from the first. And also, the oldest evidence is at least 1,000 years before any biblical text was ever written down. And also this, that there's never been a flood in Jerusalem. There's never been a flood in Jerusalem. Whereas in Mesopotamia, there are floods all the time, big and little, and must once in a while been really disastrous things. So I think that's the relationship between them. It's a digest, as you might say.
And so much of Genesis, I feel like 1 through 11 is just polemic against, I'm imagining Dr. Michael Heiser I took a class on Old Testament under him, and he talked about you imagine the Israelite captives in Babylon, and they're sitting there, and the way he kind of explained it was, you have these guys sitting around the river, and you're hearing all these Babylonians being like, oh yeah, how's that? How good's your God now? And then instead, so you have the Israelite scribes take their stories and write polemics against them, kind of giving Yahweh the credit that all their gods had for all the things that they have in there. But that's the way that he kind of it broke that down to in short terms. But me personally, I definitely don't see how someone would. There's just too many things that correlate from the Mesopotamian tradition, the biblical tradition. Like, sure, they could all be talking about some ancient flood, but it definitely was. They're pulling these stories. You don't have putting the bird out.
That's quite serious.
That's such a small thing that there's no way they're just both of them are pulling that out of their hat. I refuse to believe that.
But there's also a slightly more compelling point about the relationship you've just been talking about, is that in the description of the flood and the ark in Hebrew, there are several words which don't otherwise exist in Hebrew, and they are borrowed from Babylonian. So the words came with the story, the loan words. That's quite punchy, I think, for evidence. Well, have you read the ark before, Noah?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Audiobook. I'm an audiobook person. I listen while I work and stuff. But I've listened to that. That one's awesome.
I never dared listen to that thing. I went and recorded it. Took a week after work, 3 hours to go. I never dared listen to it. I couldn't stand it.
It was amazing.
I love it. What's important is the difference between Chinese whispers and two guys sitting on a river, and one say, "What does your God do?" and you say, "That's all very well and good." But when you have literary dependence, such as you have between the two batches of text, that doesn't wash. And my argument was that the bit when they taught the intelligent Judeans to read and write under Nebuchadnezzar, they taught them cuneiform, and that's how they had access. And that's how they learned the text. They were taught how to read and write Babylonian, because they wanted to make them Babylonians so they didn't foment rebellion, these refugees. So they took the cream of the youth, and for 6 years they were taught how to read cuneiform. So they had the access to this literature by virtue of being able to read it. So when, in my opinion, the Bible was written to explain how it was that the chosen people, who were on such good terms with their own special God and everything was going fine, ended up in such a mess that Jerusalem was sacked, the temple was destroyed, and they were all penniless refugees in an alien country. And what the biblical text is to explain how that can be. That's what it is. It's all a justification of everything. So I don't know, but I mean, this is a complex matter. When the Ark came out, there was some trenchant reviews, especially from the southern states of America, where people suggested that I should be targeted for undermining the divine word of the Lord and things of that kind.
Oh,
But
I can imagine.
yeah, so you get toughened up, but nobody's actually turned up at a lecture with a crossbow or anything like that.
This was one that I had. So in Murkgar in the Lord of Arata,
Yeah.
there is a part where they are. It's actually I have it open over here. It's the chant to him, the holy song. It's the incantation of Nudimud.
Yeah.
Nudimud. And in it they talk about addressing Enlil in one language. Is there any other text? I'm just trying to figure out because I feel like there's so much Old Testament stuff that's pulled straight out of this, and I'm just wondering what other is there an idea anywhere? And I haven't come across any. This is the only thing that I've come across that's even close. But the idea of like a Babel story of well, everyone used to speak this, and then now we do this. Is that something that they're referring back to? That there's more literature on, or what does that come from?
Well, there's something in Enmerkar and the Lord of Arata about the beginning of writing, isn't there?
Mm-hmm. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
And as it were, the creation of writing. And I'm not sure whether that speaking in one language is something to do with that process. There's nothing like the Babel story at all, nothing whatsoever. The first thing is that the old language, Sumerian, was kept alive all the way down to the end of the first millennium for 3,000 years, even when no one spoke it. So, and many people in Mesopotamia were bilingual. They spoke Sumerian and Babylonian, and later they spoke Babylonian and Aramaic. So they had actually in their society the opposite situation, that many people knew two languages and they flourished side by side. And the Babel story is predicated on the Tower of the ziggurat in Babylon. So you see, the thing was, the ziggurat is like a wedding cake. It goes up to heaven, and it was built for that reason, so that the king could be as near to possible as the gods and commune with them. And so, in the Judean eyes, this was an affront, and that God was insulted by this and interrupted the work and imposed the languages as a kind of punishment. But you know something very interesting, that when you look at the ziggurat, it has sides and it goes in and it goes in like that. So it looks unfinished. Because if you were going to build a tower up to heaven, then you would have straight sides, or you might have a grounding like a lighthouse, like a tree that goes out for stability, but you wouldn't have it in blocks like a wedding cake. And when you see that against the horizon, as a way I think of it, is the Judeans who walked all the way from Jerusalem and saw from the remote distance this building, which is going to be their new home. And it looks like they stopped work halfway through and they never finished it. Oh. And if you go, I never thought about this until I went to Syria on a dig. And it's very common when you drive in Syria, you pass houses that have been started. So they've grown, they built the ground floor, and then you have rusting poles of iron sticking up, which were going to support the next floor, which they never got round to doing. Either they ran out of money, or this, or this, or this. So there are many on the horizon there, unfinished houses. And when you look at the ziggurat, which is supposed to go all the way up to heaven, so you could go and talk to Marduk or whatever it is, it looks like it was interrupted. That's what gave them the idea that the work was stopped.
Oh, interesting. That makes perfect sense.
And of course the bricks were made of, like described in the book, and it's actually that actual building. So it's quite extraordinary that if you take things literally, the explanations are simple, and they're also true, and they're not. If you cover everything with mystique and so forth, and you deflect, then you have nothing but confusion. But that is surely the truth of the matter.
Okay. so that's where is there a tradition of Eridu, the city of Eridu, being associated with Babel? Because I've seen that argument where someone said that, well, the what the Tower of Babel is talking about is the city of Eridu for whatever reason. I'm not the reasoning I don't know behind it, but I didn't know. But it sounds like you answered it. I mean,
Yes,
that
also there was a quarter of Babylon which was called Eridu, which
oh,
confused the matter.
okay.
That's a rather awkward thing, like Manhattan or something. So,
Yeah, okay. So yeah, well that's all right.
yeah.
Well that's that. Um
Yes, there are undoubtedly things that were taken into the text of the Bible, especially at the beginning of the book, because in my view, the tradition of the Judeans that they had already was it didn't cover creation properly. It didn't cover lots of things, and so they pinched ideas because they could read them, as I explained before. So, for example, the bit about Moses and the bulrushes and that boat is a retelling of a story which applied to an old king of Mesopotamia, exactly the same thing.
Sargon, correct?
Yeah, exactly. And they pinched the story to apply to Moses in order to attack the Egyptians and make fun of them. So it's all. I mean, the real thing about about that story is that the princess, the Egyptian princess, sees this thing in the river with the baby in it, and they rescue it, and she takes it back to the palace, and they have a problem because they can't feed the baby, because ancient Egyptian women, as you know from wall paintings, didn't have any breasts. They're all made of cardboard and they're all going like this. So there probably wasn't a mammary gland among them. So what happened is they had to get one of the Judean women to suckle this child to keep it alive. And they employed the mother, and they didn't know. And what idiots they were. And that's a huge joke. They must have roared with laughter at the stupid Egyptians. They paid the mother to suckle her own baby. I mean, that's what that text is really about. It's the story, which is a hoary story, old story from Mesopotamia about an ancient king. And of course, Moses has to have a famous start. So they pinch the marvelous thing about the basket. And at the same time, they attack the Egyptians and they make a joke out of it. And, you know,
Kill two birds with one stone.
Precisely so. Precisely so.
Right. I have one more question, then I will stop taking up your time. And it was really about any evil. So what you're and I think I understand you correctly is this started out as just the end of kind of like, well, get this guy, get this guy, get this guy, and any other evil, whatever else there is, this as well. And then it slowly became an individual entity that was okay. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it's a remarkable thing in two ways. One of them is that the exorcist who was driving out a demon, who didn't know who it was, or an evil force, will often say, whether you are a ghost or an Ahazu demon or a Lamashtu demon or a Labatsu demon or this demon or that demon, because if you get the right name, if you say whether you are a ghost and it is a ghost, then the magic works. But if you're not a ghost and you say ghost, then it doesn't. So if you list them one by one, you nail them sooner or later. But just because the list is long and you don't know all their names, they had this idea of a kind of codicil or any other evil. And I can't remember if I wrote about it in that book, but what it reminds me of this is if you get a publisher, if you write a manuscript and they agree to publish it, and they send you a contract about how they got you by the short and curlies and you can't do anything, and they get all the money, and they cover every single possibility, including forms of broadcasting not yet invented. That's a legal conception that you can have a thing covering stuff that might come along after this date, but will still be affected. And it's the same kind of idea of you need one clause that covers things that you might have forgotten or might, something like that. So this mimma lemnu, which means any evil, was just tapped on the end. And it went on like that for a very long period of time. And when you have a situation where sometimes you make a figurine of an object, of a demon or something, in order to bury it, stick things in it, or crush it so that the force goes away, because of the peculiarity of the Mesopotamian mind, it became possible to make a figurine of this evil, any evil. It became a realizable entity, and a recognizable entity, when it's actually, it never existed. It's like, it's a very, very extraordinary thing. So that's why we have these tablets with drawings on, so that if somebody wanted to make one, they knew what it looked like. So it transposed from any other I haven't thought of to it, any
This
evil.
guy.
It's a very remarkable thing, actually, I think.
Wow. That it makes me think of like the figure in the book of Job, the Satan figure, the Ha-Satan.
Yeah.
But you know, it obviously you so in Hebrew, the Satan would be the adversary. Hebrew doesn't have you can't put the definite article in front of the proper name. So you have this figure who is the adversary in the book of Job, and used a few times, I think, in Zechariah and a few other passages. But then over the intertestamental period, slowly gets amalgamated into not Ha-Satan, but just Satan, into Satan. And now come into the New Testament, and you have this fleshed out entity that really has nothing to do with the same name in the Old Testament.
That's
so
a very
it's
good
just
analogy. I didn't think of it before. Yeah, yes, you're
but
quite right.
it works just kind of it's just people messing with it over time. I mean, it makes perfect sense as how, well, we got to flesh this out. What's this guy do? Well, or even if, you know, because there's it's just so natural. It just feels so natural that is exactly what they would do with the things they're working with. But
no, I think that's very astute. I didn't think of that parallel, but it's certainly correct. I think it's really very interesting. Brilliant, good stuff.
But
so when you come to London, come to the British Museum, and we'll have a cup of tea.